Episode 2 of the real history of Middle East versus United States of America. The real truth. I want to start tonight with something different. No jokes at the top, no chip bag, no comedy skit, because what I'm about to walk you through tonight is one of the most brutal, most extensive, and most systematically ignored chapters of human history, and it deserves your full attention. Before I get to the part where I make you angry at the people who decided not to teach it to you, close your eyes for a second. I know that sounds weird on a YouTube show, but bear with me. Picture a port city. It's 1620. The city is Algiers on the North African coast. The air smells like salt water and something else. Something you don't want to identify but can't ignore. The market is already open at dawn. There are merchants here from across the known world. There's spice, there's cloth, there's livestock, and there is Badistan. The Badistan is the great slave market of Algiers, and what is for sale in the Badistan is not from Africa. The people in the Badistan, the people standing on the auction block, the people in chains, the people being examined like livestock by potential buyers, they have names like Patrick, Giovanni, and Simus, and Maria. They are fishermen from Sicily, they are farmers from Ireland, they are sailors from England and Holland and Spain, they are priests from Portugal, they are women from the coast of France who were taken in raids on their own homes, they are children. They are white, they are European, and they are Christian. And they're being sold. This is not a scene from an alternate history novel. This is documented, archived, verified fact. The Barbary slave trade, the systematic kidnapping, raiding, and sale of white European Christians and later Americans by the Barbary states of North Africa was one of the largest, longest-running slave trades in human history. Let me give you the numbers, because this is where it becomes impossible to explain away as a footnote. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, a span of roughly 300 years, historians estimate that between 1 and 1.25 million white Europeans were enslaved by the Barbary states. That estimate comes primarily from Robert Davis, a professor of history at the Ohio State University, whose 2003 book, Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, is the most comprehensive scholarly accounting of this trade. He wasn't a polemicist. He was writing for a political audience. He spent years in European church archives counting ransom records, parish documents, and diplomatic correspondence to arrive at that number. Just think about over a million across 300 years, from coastlines stretching from the Canary Islands to Iceland. Yes, Iceland. Barbary raiders reached Iceland in 1627 and took approximately 400 captives from Iceland. Let me walk you through some of the specific incidents that have been documented, because I think the scale not only becomes real when you see it as individual stories. June 20th. 1631, Baltimore, Ireland. Not Baltimore, Maryland, the little fishing village of Baltimore on the southwestern coast of Ireland. In the pre-dawn hours, a fleet of Barbary corsairs led by Dutch renegade named Murat Reis comes ashore. They move through the village systematically, taking people from their beds. By morning, 107 men, women, and children have been seized and loaded onto ships. 107 people from a village of maybe 200. That's more than a half the village gone overnight. Most of them never seen again. Their names are in Irish church records. Some historians have compiled the list. These are not statistics. These are people with names and families and lives that were simply erased from the coast of Ireland in a single night. The Italian coastline was perhaps the most consistently hit. Hundreds of coastal villages, particularly in Sicily, Sardinia, and Calabria, were regularly raided. Some villages were hit so many times that residents simply abandoned the coast and moved inland. There are coastal areas of southern Italy where, if you look at the map today, you will find the actual medieval villages 3 to 5 miles inland from the water. Not because the fishing was better inland, but because the coast was too dangerous to live on. They built their villages out of pirate range, and then they built watchtowers on the coast to signal when the ships appeared. You can still see some of those towers today. They're in tourist brochures. Nobody explains what they were for. But now you know what they were for. And that is a real, honest history. Now let's talk about what happened to you if you actually were taken. Your fate depended largely on who you were and what you could offer. If you were a skilled craftsman, a carpenter, a shipwright, a metal worker, you had a value as a laborer. You would be put to work. You would be housed, fed minimally, and worked until you couldn't work anymore, or until someone paid your ransom. If you were a woman of a certain age, you might be sold into a household as a domestic slave or potentially into a haram. These records on this are somewhat sparse because the buyers didn't keep public receipts, but the accounts that exist from ransomed captives are harrowing. If you were a sailor, the most common type of captive, you were most likely assigned to the oars of a war galley, rowing in chains, day after day. This was considered among the worst possible fates in the pre-modern world. The historical accounts for galley slavery describe conditions that are almost incomprehensible by modern standards. If you had money, or if someone who loved you had money, you might eventually be ransomed. The ransom market was sophisticated. There were brokers. There were set prices for different types of captives. There were European organizations, the Trinitarian Friars, the Mercedarians, whose entire religious mission was to collect donations and travel to North Africa to ransom Christian slaves. This was their full-time job for centuries. Think about that. There were Catholic religious orders whose entire purpose, whose entire reason for existing was to save white Europeans from North African slavery. They raised money across Europe, negotiated with slave traders, and bought people back for centuries. And somehow, this is not a chapter in the textbook, in any textbook. Let's actually think about this seriously. Because I don't want to just be a grievance delivery machine tonight. I want to understand the mechanism by which this history gets quietly shelved. There are a few explanations. The first is narrative dissonance, the dominant moral framework for discussing slavery in the contemporary Western and particularly American academic culture is built almost entirely around transatlantic slave trade, the kidnapping and forced transport of Africans to the Americas. That story involves a specific set of perpetrators and a specific set of victims, and has enormous and legitimate moral weight. It has shaped American society in ways that are still being worked through. The Barbary slave trade complicates that framework because in the Barbary story, the perpetrators are not European, the victims are not African. The entire moral architecture that has been built around the transatlantic narrative doesn't apply. And rather than simply expand the moral framework to condemn all slavery in all forms, the path of least resistance is to simply not to discuss it.
Because in the Barbary story, the perpetrators are not European. The entire morale architecture that has been built around the transatlantic narrative doesn't apply.
The second explanation is political inconvenience. The Barbary slave trade, as we discussed last episode, is deeply connected to a specific religious ideology that sanctioned it and justified it explicitly. The victims are the same group, Western Christians. And in the last episode, the specific religious ideology was Islam, and that their prophet gave them not just the right, but the duty to enslave, steal, and kill the infidels who did not believe in Muhammad and Allah, as it's written in Quran. And these victims are the same group, Western Christians, who are frequently cast as historical perpetrators in modern academic discussions. Centering them as victims of a massive centuries-long atrocity does not fit comfortably into several popular contemporary frameworks. The third explanation is simply that the records are harder to find. The transatlantic slave trade is extensively documented in American and British archives. The Barbary trade is documented in European church archives, in Italian municipal records, in Spanish ransom documents, in Irish parish books, and in North African sources that are harder to access and translate. Robert Davis's work was groundbreaking partly because he actually went and did the archival work that nobody had done systematically before. Because the academia in United States doesn't even want to bother with any sources that are from European origin, they don't even want to include it because it breaks their beliefs, their propaganda that they're trying to convince everybody it's the white man's fault, especially the new immigrants trying to only reiterate and speak of this false narrative that it's all the white man's fault when we can clearly look at the history and see what's really going on.
None of this erases or diminishes the horror of American slavery. This is simply insisting that if we are going to talk about history of slavery, honestly, we talk about all of it.
Let me explain the theological framework.
The specific religious ideology was Islam, and that their prophet gave them not just the right, but the duty to enslave.
Because I think this is the thing that is most consistently omitted from the incomplete accounts that do make it to mainstream coverage. Under the legal framework of the Barbary states, non-Muslim captives taken in warfare were classified as ganima, meaning war spoils, the infidels. Specifically, they were considered legitimate slaves under Islamic law as it was interpreted and applied in those states. They had no legal standing as persons, they could not testify in court, they could not own property, they could not appeal their condition. They were property. This was not a fringe interpretation. This was the official legal position of the state, endorsed by the religious authorities, documented in official correspondence. The Ambassador of Tripoli explained it explicitly to Jefferson and Adams. It wasn't hidden, it was policy.
The specific religious ideology was Islam, and that their prophet gave them not just the right, but the duty to enslave.
And critically, this was how it had been before centuries, before any significant European presence in the region. This predates the Crusades. This predates European colonialism in Africa. This predates transatlantic slave trade. You cannot explain this as a response to Western action because it was happening before Western action actually occurred. I want to say something that I feel is important. Acknowledging this history is not an attack on Muslims today. I need that to be heard clearly. The vast, overwhelming majority of Muslims living in the world today, including in countries that were once Barbary states, are not responsible for what happened in the 16th and 17th centuries, any more than modern Germans are personally responsible for the Holocaust, or modern Americans are personally responsible for slavery in the antebellum South. Historical accountability does not work by collective guilt across centuries. I don't believe in that. And I'm not arguing for that. What I am arguing for is that the historical truth deserves to be part of the conversation. All of it. Not the version curated to fit a predetermined moral framework. The full picture. Because here's what the full picture shows us. Slavery was not invented by white Europeans. Slavery was not exclusive to white Europeans. Slavery was not aimed exclusively at Africans. Slavery was a global institution practiced by virtually every major civilization in human history. And many of its worst chapters involved the enslavement of white Europeans and white Americans by non-European powers. That is a fact, not a political opinion, not a conservative talking point, a historical fact documented in archives across 4 continents. The Ottoman Empire kept slaves until the early 20th century. The Arabian Peninsula had legal slavery until 1962 in Saudi Arabia. Slavery exists in parts of the world right now, today in 2026. primarily in parts of Africa and the Middle East, according to the Global Slavery Index. None of this erases or diminishes the horror of American slavery. None of this is an attempt to score points in a culture war. This is simply insisting that if we are going to talk about history of slavery, honestly, we talk about all of it, the full scope, the full timeline, the full cast of perpetrators and victims. Because anything less than the full picture is not education. It's propaganda with a nicer cover.
None of this erases or diminishes the horror of American slavery. This is simply insisting that if we are going to talk about history of slavery, honestly, we talk about all of it.
Your action tonight is simple. Go to the archives and find the names. Double check me, fact check me, and you will see. The Library of Congress has records of American sailors held in Barbary captivity. The names are there. The ransom demands are there. The desperate letters home are there. The captivity narratives, accounts written by men who survived and came home, are also there. Find the name of one person, just one. An Irish name from Baltimore, or an American sailor from Massachusetts, or a Sicilian fisherman whose name appears in a ransom record in Palermo. Make it real for yourself, because history is not real until it has a face, and these people have been faceless for too long. I'm Bam Bam, your host of the RusNkaZ Show. Never let their story be erased. Good night. Stay true, stay honest, and always remember that God loves you.
This is the RusNkaZ Show. Bam Bam calling shots.